What if I told you the story of a country born not just from war, but from a 2,000-year-old promise? A nation willed into existence by a Viennese playwright, bankrolled by a Rothschild, and greenlit by a British Empire desperate to win a war. The origin story of Israel is one of the most debated, most explosive, and most misunderstood stories in modern history. How did an ancient, scattered people manage to build a country in the 20th century? Why was it established in that exact spot? And how did its creation instantly trigger a conflict that still shapes our world today? Forget what you think you know. We're about to unravel the entire unbelievable origin story of Israel, from ancient scrolls to a UN vote that changed the world forever. Stick around because every single piece of this puzzle is critical. All right, let's get into it. To understand the origin of Israel, you can't start in 1948. You can't even start in the 20th century. You have to go way, way back, like sandal-wearing, chariot-riding, biblical back. For centuries, the land we now call Israel and Palestine was, for the Jewish people, the ancient kingdom of Israel, the land of Zion, the place where their holiest temple stood in Jerusalem. But then came the Romans. In 70 AD, they crushed a Jewish revolt, destroyed the Second Temple, and basically scattered the Jewish people across the globe. This event wasn't just a military defeat. It was the beginning of the great diaspora. That's the key word here. For the next 1900 years, Jews lived as minorities in Europe, the Middle East, everywhere. And life in the diaspora? It wasn't great. They faced everything from suspicion and segregation to brutal, violent persecutions called pogroms, especially in Eastern Europe. Yet through all of it, they held on to this one single unifying idea: next year in Jerusalem. It was a prayer, a hope, a cultural memory that one day they would return to their ancestral homeland. It was a nice dream, right? But for nearly 2 millennia, that's all it was, a dream. So what changed? How did this ancient prayer suddenly become a geopolitical project? Well, things got really bad in the late 19th century. In places like the Russian Empire, the pogroms became state-sponsored terror. Entire villages were wiped out. At the same time, in supposedly enlightened Western Europe, a new, more sinister kind of anti-Jewish sentiment was brewing: anti-Semitism. This wasn't just religious intolerance, it was a racial ideology that painted Jews as outsiders who could never truly belong. The breaking point for many came during the Dreyfus Affair in France. In 1894, a Jewish army captain named Alfred Dreyfus was falsely convicted of treason. The case ripped France apart, and the public outcry was shockingly anti-Semitic. Covering the trial was a journalist from Vienna, a charismatic, secular Jew named Theodor Herzl. Herzl had an earth-shattering realization. Watching the mobs in Paris scream "Death to the Jews!" he concluded that assimilation, just trying to fit in, was a fantasy. He believed that as long as Jews were a minority everywhere, they would never be safe. The only solution, he argued, was for them to have a state of their own, a Jewish state. That's the aha moment. The dream transforms from a religious hope into a modern political movement. In 1897, Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Zionism, simply put, is the movement for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the land of Zion. Herzl was an incredible organizer. He created a political structure, a flag, an anthem. He essentially built a government in waiting before they even had a square foot of land to govern. He famously wrote in his diary after the Congress, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. In 50 years, everyone will see it." It was an insane prediction. But how close would he get? The problem was the land they dreamed of wasn't empty. It was part of the massive, centuries-old Ottoman Empire. and it was inhabited by a diverse population, the majority of whom were Arabs, both Muslim and Christian. Small Jewish communities had always lived there, but now, inspired by Zionism, a trickle of Jewish immigrants from Europe began arriving to set up agricultural communities. It was a slow start, but the fuse had been lit. A tiny dream was starting to meet a complex reality on the ground. And it's right here, in this collision of an ancient dream and a modern world, that our channel, The Unifying Lens, loves to explore. We dive into these massive, complex stories from history to figure out not just what happened, but why and how it still affects us all. If you enjoy untangling these incredible historical knots, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep making these deep dives, and honestly, it means the world to us. Your support lets us piece together these crucial stories. So Herzl dies in 1904, long before his dream could be realized. The Zionist movement is growing, but it's still a fringe idea. Jewish immigration to Ottoman Palestine is happening, but it's slow. They need a game changer, an earthquake. And that earthquake was called World War I. The Great War completely redraws the map of the world, especially the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the region for 400 years, sided with Germany and lost badly. Suddenly, their vast territories, including Palestine, were up for grabs, and the world's new superpower, the British Empire, was ready to carve it up. This is where the story gets wild, with backroom deals and contradictory promises. The British were desperate to win the war. They made a promise to the Arabs for a huge independent Arab kingdom if they would revolt against the Ottomans. Spoiler alert, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was a key player here. But at the same time, the British were talking to the Zionists. Why? Well, it was a mix of strategic calculation and, weirdly enough, religious sentiment among some British leaders. Key figures in the Zionist movement, like Chaim Weizmann, a brilliant chemist who helped the British war effort, were also fantastic diplomats. Weizmann lobbied London hard, arguing that a Jewish presence in Palestine would be friendly to British interests near the crucial Suez Canal. He convinced them that Jewish support in places like America and Russia could help the Allied war effort, and it worked. In 1917, the British government issued a public letter. It's one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century, the Balfour Declaration. It stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Boom! That's it! That's the moment. For the first time ever, a major world power had officially endorsed the Zionist project. It was a political victory of staggering proportions. But read the fine print. It also said that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. There's the contradiction baked right in. How do you create a national home for one group without affecting the rights of the 90% of the population who already live there? The British basically kicked that can down the road. But what would happen when that road ran out? After the war, the new League of Nations gave Britain the job of governing the territory under a system called the British Mandate for Palestine. Their official task was to help establish that Jewish national home while protecting the Arab population. It was a recipe for disaster. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Jewish emigration, fueled by rising anti-Semitism in Europe, increased dramatically. They bought land, built cities like Tel Aviv, established universities, and created a robust, self-governing community called the Yishuv. They had their own political parties, trade unions, and even a paramilitary defense force, the Haganah. But all this progress created friction. The Arab population watched as their country was being transformed. They saw their demographic majority shrinking and feared they would be displaced and ruled by newcomers. This led to resentment, protests, and eventually violence. There were major Arab riots in 1921 and 1929, and from 1936 to 1939, a full-blown Arab revolt erupted against both the British and the Zionists. The British crushed it brutally, but it showed just how deep the opposition ran. The two communities were now locked in a zero-sum conflict. The British were trapped in the middle, unable to satisfy either side. They tried limiting Jewish immigration to appease the Arabs, which in turn angered the Jews. Then came the darkest chapter in human history, World War II and the Holocaust. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany changed everything. It wasn't a pogrom. It was an industrial-scale genocide. For the Zionist movement, the Holocaust was the ultimate horrific proof of Herzl's argument that Jews would never be safe without a state of their own. For the survivors languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe, Palestine wasn't just a political project, it was their only hope for a future. After the war, the pressure to allow Jewish immigration into Palestine became immense. The world was horrified by the Holocaust, and sympathy for the Jewish cause was at an all-time high. Radical Jewish underground groups like the Irgun and the Lehi began waging a guerrilla war against the British, blowing up bridges, police stations, and even the British headquarters at the King David Hotel. By 1947, Britain was exhausted, broke from the war, and had completely failed to solve the puzzle they created. They gave up. They handed the problem of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. The UN sent a committee, they investigated, and they came back with a dramatic solution: partition. The idea was to split the land. The 1947 UN Partition Plan, or Resolution 181, proposed dividing the British Mandate into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish. Jerusalem would be a special international city. The Jewish state was allocated 56% of the land, even though Jews only made up about a third of the population and owned less than 10% of the land. The plan was a massive victory for the Zionists. It gave them international legitimacy for statehood. The Jewish leadership accepted it immediately. The Arab world, however, rejected it furiously. They saw it as the theft of their land by colonial powers. Why should they have to give up their territory to solve a European problem? As the UN vote approached, the fate of the region and the world hung in the balance. The UN vote on November 29, 1947 was pure drama. It was broadcast live on the radio, and people around the world were glued to their sets. The Zionists needed a 2/3 majority. After intense lobbying from all sides, the resolution passed, 33-13, with 10 abstentions. In the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Jewish communities erupted in celebration. It was the moment they had dreamed of for 2,000 years. But in Arab towns and villages and across the Arab world, there was rage. The vote immediately triggered a civil war inside Palestine. Arab and Jewish militias clashed, and the fighting was brutal as both sides tried to secure as much territory as they could before the British pulled out. The British had set their departure date for May 14, 1948. As that day approached, the Jewish leadership, led by the charismatic, pragmatic David Ben-Gurion, faced a terrifying decision. Should they declare statehood? The U.S. State Department was warning them not to, fearing it would trigger a massive war that they couldn't win. They knew that the armies of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon were massing on the borders, ready to invade the second the British left. It was a massive gamble. Declaring a state could mean its immediate destruction, but not declaring it could mean letting the dream, now so close, slip away forever. Ben-Gurion decided to roll the dice. On the afternoon of May 14, 1948, just hours before the mandate expired, hundreds of Zionist leaders gathered in the Tel Aviv Museum. Ben-Gurion stood at a podium below a portrait of Theodor Herzl, and read Israel's Declaration of Independence. By virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, he declared, we hereby proclaim the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. It was done. Herzl's prediction had come true, almost to the year. But the celebration was short-lived. The very next day, the armies of 5 Arab nations invaded. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, or what Israelis called the War of Independence, had begun. The new, poorly equipped Israeli army was fighting for its life. The war was bloody and desperate, but against all odds, Israel survived and won. By the time armistices were signed in 1949, Israel controlled even more territory than the UN Partition Plan had granted them. But victory came at a huge cost. For Palestinians, the war was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, the majority of the Arab population, fled or were expelled from their homes in the territory that became Israel. They became refugees in neighboring countries, and the question of their fate, their right of return, would become the core of the conflict for decades to come. So there it is. The origin of Israel isn't a single event. It's a convergence of ancient history, 19th century political theory, world wars, backroom deals, the horror of the Holocaust, and a final, fateful vote. It was the realization of a 2,000-year-old dream for one people, and the beginning of a catastrophic displacement for another. The birth of Israel didn't end the story. It was the explosive start of a new chapter, one that continues to be written in conflict and controversy to this very day. What an incredible story, right? The creation of Israel is one of those historical moments that really changed the world. What part of the story surprised you the most? Was it Herzl's prediction? The Balfour Declaration? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please give this video a like and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next exploration into the stories that define our world. Thanks for watching.